Ego is id. A connection is commonly drawn between the development of psychology and the rise of the bourgeois individual, both in antiquity and since the Renaissance. This ought not to obscure the contrary tendency also common to psychology and the bourgeois class, and which today has developed to the point of excluding all others, the suppression and dissolution of the very individual in whose service knowledge was related back to its subject. If all psychology since that of Protagoras has elevated man by conceiving him as the measure of all things, it has thereby also treated him from the first as an object, as material for analysis, and transferred to him, once he was included among them, the nullity of things. The denial of objective truth by recourse to the subject implies the negation of the latter. No measure remains for the measure of all things. Lapsing into contingency, he becomes untruth. But this points back to the real-life process of society. The principle of human domination in becoming absolute has turned its point against man as the absolute object, and psychology has collaborated in sharpening that point. The self, its guiding idea, and its a priori object has always, under its scrutiny, been rendered at the same time non-existent in appealing to the fact that in an exchange society the subject was not one, but in fact a social object. Psychology provided society with weapons for ensuring that this was and remained the case. The dissection of man into his faculties is a projection of the division of labor onto its pretended subjects, inseparable from the interest in deploying and manipulating them to greater advantage. Psychotechnics is not merely a form of psychology's decay, but is inherent in its principle. Hume, whose work bears witness in every sentence to his real humanism, yet who dismisses the self as a prejudice, expresses in this contradiction the nature of psychology as such. In this he even has truth on his side, for that which posits itself as I is indeed mere prejudice, an ideological hypostasization of the abstract centers of domination, criticism of which demands the removal of the ideology of personality. But its removal also makes the residue all the easier to dominate. This is flagrantly apparent in psychoanalysis. It incorporates personality as a lie needed for living, as the supreme rationalization holding together the innumerable rationalizations by which the individual achieves his instinctual renunciation and accommodates himself to the reality principle. But precisely in demonstrating this, it confirms man's non-being, alienating him from himself, denouncing his autonomy with his unity. Psychoanalysis subjugates him totally to the mechanism of rationalization, of adaptation. The ego's unflinching self-criticism gives way to the demand that the ego of the other capitulate. The psychoanalyst's wisdom finally becomes what the fascist unconscious of the horror magazines takes it for, a technique by which one particular racket among others binds suffering and helpless people irrevocably to itself in order to command and exploit them. Suggestion and hypnosis, rejected by psychoanalysis as apocryphal, the charlatan magician masquerading before a fairground booth, reappear within its grandiose system as the silent film does in the Hollywood epic. What was formerly help through greater knowledge has become the humiliation of others by dogmatic privilege. All that remains of the criticism of bourgeois consciousness is the shrug with which doctors have always signaled their secret complicity with death. In psychology, in the bottomless fraud of mere inwardness, which is not by accident concerned with the properties of men, is reflected what bourgeois society has practiced for all time with outward property. The latter, as a result of social exchange, has been increased, but with a proviso dimly present to every bourgeois. The individual has been, as it were, merely invested with property by the class, and those in control are ready to take it back as soon as universalization of property seems likely to endanger its principle, which is precisely that of withholding. Psychology repeats in the case of properties that was done to property. It expropriates the individual by allocating him its happiness.